Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast. We are talking today about Masons in the Military again, part 2. And also, we have an author with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our opinions and thoughts are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions, either here on YouTube or on our Facebook page. We'd also appreciate a thumbs up and especially any comments on our videos. Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast. I'm David Colbeth, a Master Mason in Washington State. I'm joined today by Matt Appel, who is also a Master Mason in Washington State, and Steve Chung, who is a Master Mason, not just in British Columbia, but in the great valley of the Kelowna. I always want to mess that up. Hey, we're also joined by our good friend, Colonel retired Jonathan Davenport, who likes us to call him JD, and author, correct?
Yes, sir.
Of several books now. So we'll probably talk about that as well. But today, our focus is a little bit on Masons in the military. So right off the bat, who is the oldest Mason that was in the military? Anybody know? That's not really a trick question, at least for the United States. Who is our iconic military man that was a Mason?
Well, I could say George Washington.
You would be right.
Since he was not only general of the army, but eventually president and declined to be king, all of which makes him a good guy in my book.
Exactly. So yes, I would say that Washington is probably our most iconic military Mason, other than JD, of course.
I actually have, when I graduated from the War College, they gave me a tie, and it's when Washington went out to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. So the U.S. Army War College is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and that is the fort that they rode out of to go put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And there's an iconic painting, if you will, of him and his staff with their horses walking down the main street of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And that scene is what's on the tie. It's very cool that they didn't actually end up having to do anything, but it was still one of those iconic moments of where he was actually, as president and still commander-in-chief, he actually went out and was going to lead troops.
Huh. Now, when they say put down the revolution, was that actually put down, or is that?
I have to say, if you go down Main Street in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, there are more establishments that serve some kind of alcohol than anything else. So maybe.
Uh-huh. Yes, the true runners.
On a totally side note, my father-in-law actually is a volunteer at the museum there. He moves documents around and photocopies things and that sort of stuff. He's
nice.
really into it. So.
How long has he been there?
Oh, he's lived out in that area all his life. He's volunteered there, I don't know, 6 or 8 years now. He retired from the Army as a warrant officer.
2010 to 2012.
Oh, well. Yeah, there's probably some overlap there. He was a warrant officer in the military, in the Army, and he retired. Started doing that.
Cool.
So obviously his name's not Appel. What's his last name?
Prendergast. John Prendergast.
I have met a John Prendergast.
Ah. Uh-oh.
Nice.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So what other iconic military men are Masons that you know of, JD?
I think one of the coolest ones that goes back to talking about Veterans Day and Armistice Day is our very first U.S. person on the ground in Europe. The first one to hit the shores of France was Blackjack Pershing. And Pershing, a Mason, has a couple of claims to fame. One was that he had just been serving in the Philippines about a year before that. And then he was put into Mexico to go chase down a certain villain, and then it went immediately from that to go into Europe and meet with the French, get them kind of back into the fight, and to provide some landing places for U.S. forces that were going to get involved. So he was there, I want to say it was late spring, early summer of 1917. He was promoted from captain to brigadier general.
Huh.
That is a huge jump for anyone who doesn't know. That is 4 ranks at once. And in officer parlance, I was a captain for 8 years and a major for 7 and a lieutenant colonel for 6. I mean, this guy went from captain to brigadier general.
That's a jump even on a battlefield.
Yeah. So it wasn't until early 1918 that we actually put troops on the ground. And 18 months later, the war ended. So, and it was basically, you could go to any of the senior army staffs of the other countries involved. Doesn't matter which side of the conflict they were on. Every one of them afterwards said, as soon as the Americans picked a side and showed up on the ground, it was the beginning of the end. And more than anything, we had the most recently undeveloped society. So we had the most people who were willing to go get dirty and go blow some stuff up.
And so you said the leader was a Mason. Blackjack was a Mason.
Blackjack Pershing. Yep, John J. Pershing. He was a Mason, and that's probably why when the division staffs started to show up, that they were all Masons.
And you said that wasn't a prerequisite, but it was definitely prolific.
Oh yeah.
I've heard that about, like, in France. We have some brothers here that are from France, and his brother is still in France. And he said one of his reasons his dad didn't become a Mason was because of the requirement for senior management and government and other places like that you have to be a Mason to advance. And so he kind of rebelled. His dad kind of rebelled a little bit, but he and his brother are now both active Masons.
Yeah, there's definitely been some long-term effect from that, and both from that period and into World War II. And on World War II, the issue became that the Nazi Party actually hunted Masons down, because going back to Kaiser Wilhelm and World War I, they looked at what the Masons did with continuing relations with other countries as traitorous. And so one of Hitler and Himmler and Goering's first orders of business was to take out all of the Masonic lodges in Germany.
Well, they didn't want to have any secret societies that could uprise against them too, right?
Right.
Yeah. Pass messages under the desk and yeah.
Heavens. Unheard of.
So you're down in Washington, JD. I'm curious as to whether or not you guys have participated in joint celebrations, Veterans Day and up here in we call it Remembrance Day.
Oh yeah.
You guys ever have those joint events for those things?
Absolutely. We've actually hosted a Canadian unit here in the Auburn Veterans Day Parade before. That'll be going on this Saturday. We've had several with the law enforcement exchange. Some good friends of mine were shot in a coffee shop down here in Parkland, and an entire Canadian department showed up for that remembrance. And a good friend of mine actually just retired out of the U.S. Navy from a Canadian position. He was the senior staff submariner on the west coast of Canada for the last 3 years. So he was an exchange officer. Then he actually retired. He had to come down here to Bremerton to go through the retirement process for about 30 days.
Wow, that's interesting.
Had you ever done any work with Canadian forces while you're...
Yeah, so 1st Canadian Division, I did the entire West Coast Air Defense Sector planning. And then in Afghanistan, 2 different Canadian SAS teams worked for me. And then in Africa, believe it or not, some of the Canadians showed up when I was on a French Foreign Legion base. I can't really tell you all about that, other than, yes, there were some Canadians there in East Africa with me, and they were not amused because it was hot.
Uh-huh. So, Steve, I don't know if you know, do you know how many Masons in your lodge are military or veterans? I know in ours there's quite a few. It's probably more than half.
Well, I know that in the past, there were, from the artifacts in our library and whatnot, that at least a half a dozen in my lodge were members of the forces. Now, unfortunately, they've all passed away, and we have a pretty young lodge, being that I'm now the old guard.
Funny how that happens, huh?
Yeah, right. So at this point, the last remaining member, who was he was active in the RCMP, he was active in military, and he retired from CSIS, the last job he had. And he unfortunately recently passed a couple months ago. We just had I actually just received his past master's jewel from his family, and I think that's the last one that was enlisted, anyways. I'm sure there's a lot in St. George's, because St. George's Lodge here, a lot of the RCMP joined St. George's Lodge. That was one thing they had going on, was a lot of cops were in there and a lot of military people were in there. So I'm quite certain there's a bunch in there, because they've still got a bunch of their old guard.
Huh. Matt, do you know if there's what kind of ratio you guys have in your lodge, or even in the district now as deputy? I know even in our district down here, there's lots of military guys.
Yeah, I would say it's probably not half, but it's certainly a goodly number. Just thinking of the guys who regularly show up, of the whatever 20, 25 guys we get in a meeting, I would say probably 8 or 10 of them are veterans.
Yeah.
And you guys are pretty close to Lewis McCord and stuff down there, right? So you get a little more proximity. I guess we've got Everett, but
yeah, I think it's mostly, we certainly don't have, not that I know of any active guys, TD. I don't think we have any active guys, but we certainly have quite a few that are retired or just veterans. And yeah, of course, as you get closer to the bases in general, there's probably going to be more active guys. I know that's a little bit one of the problems that lodges have, is that are close to bases, they'll get guys in, they'll give them degrees, and then they ship them off, or they move to another base or something. And so there's a lot of membership all over the world that from close-knit bases that are close to lodges, and it can be difficult. But that's the great thing about Masonry is, and I've been really emphasizing that to a couple of guys that we're bringing in on inquiries to our lodge, that hey, even though you live in a different city, you don't live in Auburn, it's okay. And if you're thinking about a couple of different lodges, you can go. Once you're a Mason, doesn't matter which one you join ultimately. Just join one, and then you can go visit any lodge you want to. That's the really beautiful thing about Masonry.
Yeah,
that has always been
sorry, go ahead.
That's been a confusing thing for me too. Is a lot of people saying, well, but our community and let's be local and all this. I thought that was the whole point of being a traveling man. That was why we did it in the first place, was so we could go to other places. I'm not going to quote anything, but come on, man. So I've heard a couple of those sentiments, and I just looked at the speaker and went, you do remember all those words, right? Anyway.
Yeah, for sure. It's we have one guy in particular that's joining, and he checked out 3 lodges in the area very, very thoroughly, and we're very fortunate that he chose our lodge in Auburn to join. And but again, I emphasize to him more and more that once you're in, you can, and some guys want to join and pay membership to the other lodges, and that's great. They can be plural members if they want to, but I guess I'm a cheapskate. I just, why pay dues more than one place unless you really have to?
Well, dues is a whole other issue there.
That was another show.
Yeah, we can do that one again if you want.
I'll put a link somewhere maybe in here for that show.
I have more thoughts.
We just had a installation at Kootenai 15 in Revelstoke, and of course, they stand up and give a toast to the visitors at the banquet, and then give a big plug for affiliation. And the few of us that hadn't affiliated there, one of them piped up and says, if the rest of us affiliate, you won't have any visitors.
Valid.
I don't mind affiliating to, like, I'm a member of, we call it Grand Mountain Historic Lodges. Historic Lodge meet once a year, affiliating there, or maybe to a research lodge or something. That's a different situation. But I feel when I was younger Mason, not younger, but newer Mason, I was in awe of those guys that stand up and say, "Oh, I'm junior warden over here, and I'm senior deacon over here, and I'm this over here, and I got a member of 16 different lodges." And I always thought that was kind of cool. But what I've kind of found out in some cases is that they're joining those lodges to help them stand up, to help the lodge keep open, stay open, and possibly in some cases they're filling a chair that really should be done by a new guy that's coming in and give them a chance. And so I look at it as a little bit of a juxtaposition about being an affiliated Mason to another lodge and taking a station that maybe a new guy should have or should be trained up to take, and also helping to keep lodges open that maybe shouldn't be continuing. That's a whole nother conversation.
See, that's a show we should have too.
Artificially propping up things that maybe shouldn't stick around.
Yes. We talked about that on a show recently. I think it was on the Dues show, or I don't know, it was one of them. We talked so much about inspection. Inspection, that was the term where some jurisdictions have an inspection program where they go around and they verify that lodges can do the work. And we don't have that in Washington. It's something I've thought about trying to encourage our Master Mason brethren to vote for, but we are way off topic.
Yes.
From veterans of the military.
So if you want to talk about veterans in the military and guys who saw both sides of the military side and the peace side, George Marshall was a Mason, the author of the Marshall Plan and Nobel Peace Prize winner. So he was also Secretary of Defense. I think he might have been Secretary of State at some point. So he's a famous military guy who espoused many of the virtues of Masonry in very various ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the opportunities that you have in this forum, JD, is that this is going to be on podcast land in audio and on YouTube and video for years to come. And if there's a particular message that you wanted to see got out there, whether it's about Masons joining the military or vice versa, the floor is yours for that, man.
Okay. Well, so I have two things. The first is I am an author. I have written some novels. But those aside, one of the things that I've done is after 30 years of writing essays and papers and position pieces, there were those few moments kind of far between where there was something that struck me that I wanted to capture how I felt about it, not just analyze it to death and where do we go from here and write an after action report that goes in a binder, gets put on a shelf and nobody ever reads it. So
except Congress.
Right.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's not touch that. But I decided to write some poetry along the way. And one of the things that when I got to the point where I was going to publish it, well, the first part of it anyway, I wanted it to be able to be carried and by a soldier in a foxhole or a Jeep or a cockpit, wherever. And so it is literally the size that you can put in a shirt pocket, back pocket of a pair of jeans, a cargo pocket of a uniform, etc. And just captures from operational to how people deal with PTSD, that kind of thing. And I've actually been in contact with some of the chaplain corps about doing another one as well. And it's been a eye-opening experience for me, especially living in the land of, oh my goodness, security clearances, that the amount of people who don't want to talk about what they've been through. And they know, because they're right 90% of the time, if they do, they're going to lose that clearance. They're not going to get to do the job anymore. And so it's a tortuous path, not a dangerous path, but it is something that involves a lot of soul searching about, okay, am I screwed up enough that I'm a danger to the mission and so I should pull myself off? Or am I just screwed up enough that I'm only going to, annoy my family? I mean, there's a fine line there somewhere. I don't know what it is yet because I haven't found it. But I'm working on it. that message to me has rung true in every generation. There was, battle fatigue, and then shell shock, and then PTSD. My guys would call it "you ain't right in the head." So that's, if you want to go with the current generation version, that's probably what it is. And I don't think any of us are that continued to do it past one or two tours. I think that message, more than anything, that resonates with me is when we came from like environments, what we found was those people who went home together supported each other. If you look at every service organization within a community, I don't care if it's the American Legion, the VFW, Brothers in Arms. I actually ride motorcycles with the Combat Vets Motorcycle Association, the Masonic Lodge, the Lions Club, the Elks Club, the Eagles Club. There are military members in every one of those. I guarantee it. Number one, it's a life of service approach. Number two, what goes into those is the continuation of community. So when we signed up en masse from the Civil War to World War II, units that were groups of people largely from the same communities went together. When they came home, they could be at the pub every single night and staring at each other and go, "Oh, Bobby's coming off the rails. Somebody go grab him." But when you go with what they went to in Vietnam, where you went for a 1-year tour or less, and your number came up whenever, and you went to whatever unit what was it back then? The punch cards in the sky decided to tell the machine to send you to. When you went home, you didn't go to where that unit was from. You didn't go to where all those people came from the same hometown. And so you didn't have that same support group that was automatically there at the end of a conflict. We're still living that today. The National Guard units are having much better success at dealing with these post-activity social issues than the active duty members are, because they go home together. 150 man infantry company goes from Kent, Washington, for example, and they come home, and guess what? They all go back to Kent, Washington, and they can go stare at each other. And yeah, some people move, but not as much as we're on active duty. I could tell you that the first combat zone I went to, Panama, officially, there was not a single person from the same home state, much less the same hometown. Same thing when we went to Germany and Czechoslovakia at that time, working out of Berlin, Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait, and then the Balkans. Very, very rarely would I have somebody from my home state, much less anywhere near where I grew up. It does happen though, and it's kind of weird. I've been in the Army for 17 years, and I went to a staff here at Fort Lewis. Then it was still Fort Lewis. And every single staff officer in that operations shop, and there were 9 of us, had gone to a different Washington State university.
Wow. We
were all from this state's colleges. And I've never seen that happen before or since. But that's where we're missing the boat, really, I think, with the sociological aspect of this, is trying to get people to understand that community is important, and that finding your way back into that community and finding a support group within that community is the most important thing. Okay, my pitch is done. Sorry.
And certainly that's where a Masonic Lodge and Masons in general can help with that support group, and to be those brothers that that connection they may have not had. I mean, I know that's why everywhere in the world, but certainly in the United States and in Washington, the membership grew exponentially after World War II. There was 4 times as many Masons as there are now back then, and so that's definitely something that I've thought about that. I haven't had a meeting after the meeting about this, but that's certainly an area of men that I want. Our 1 o'clock in the morning meetings.
There are also more veterans as a proportion of society as well.
Exactly.
It is going up.
Yeah. And unfortunately, injured veterans, in the past, in the previous wars and the situations where they wouldn't make it out of theater, or they wouldn't survive. And so now there's a lot of injured veterans that are out there, and not just physically injured, but also mentally injured. And I would recommend, if guys listen to this, or if a family member knows something, if they're a veteran or they know veterans, to encourage them to go visit their local Masonic lodge and make a connection with the brothers there. And there's certainly some veterans there, or they know veterans that can help them.
So this is a side note that you may want to cut out, but in World War I, one of the things that happened before we deployed a bunch of people, there were some waivers given out and dispensations for younger soldiers who were going to deploy overseas to become members in a day, receive all the degrees in a day. And the reason is because at the time you had to be a whole man to be initiated as a Mason. And so they had already seen a lot of the fathers, if you will, who were Masons, had seen some of the rich boys coming home that had legs blown off and arms blown off, and they wanted their sons to be able to be Masons. And they knew that if they were initiated before they went, even if they came home without an arm or a leg, they could still be a Mason. But if they weren't initiated before that, they could not. It was a very interesting historical note for me.
Yeah, I was reading about that, or I saw Matt, you just unmuted there. So if you wanted to chat about it, but that was, I know each lodge can determine however they want to decide that.
Right.
Yeah, it's a pendulum that has swung both ways. There was a big relaxation in those rules shortly after the Civil War too, when the same story, a lot of guys were coming home injured, and a lot of Grand Lodges relaxed their restrictions following that, and then it, like I said, the pendulum swung back the other way eventually to.
Mm-hmm.
The rules.
I think our code is pretty generically specific on that area. That can they perform the signs and symbols more or less, and
they can materially participate in, I think is what it says.
Yeah. Can they provide a reasonable level of of identification, right? So, we've had some guys that haven't been able to do some of those things that we require, and we just make accommodations for them. The hard part would be the situations where they've had brain injuries or something, and they just can't. They're a good guy, but they just can't. They can't participate. So, well, yeah, this is so. Starting to think about some of those guys. So, I know you mentioned kind of briefly that you were part of the Combat Veterans Motorcycle Club. We just had recently an interview with our Sons of Hiram Riding Club, our Masonic Riding Club. How long have you been with the Combat Vets Riding Club?
10 years. Actually, it's longer than that, but I had a break. I joined once and then was deployed for a while, and so I let my membership lapse for a couple of years. And then when I came home, went back. So I think I went back in 2009. So I think it's 10 years, probably a little over 10 years. Yeah.
Are there quite a few Masons in that organization that you know?
There are several. There's not like a preponderance or anything. There's what's ironic is that one of the members of my chapter is also being installed as master of his lodge at Alki on the same day at the same time. And we found out about 6 weeks ago. We were just at some random bar somewhere staring at each other. Every Thursday night, we have what we call a weekly safety meeting, and it's not us checking whether we're safe, it's checking whether we're safe to be in society. But we stare at each other and go, "Hey, how you doing?" And not everybody comes to every one of them, and we move them around the area so that it's closer to some people than others. And when he asked me, "Hey, you're coming to my installation?" I said, "When is it?" He goes, "December 7th at 6 p.m. I said, let me answer your question with a question. Are you coming to my installation? He goes, "When is it?" I said, "December 7th at 6 p.m. He's like, no. It was just ironic that we're the only two in our group. We're probably two of the only 5 in Western Washington, and we're being installed as master of our lodges on the same day at the same hour.
Great minds think alike.
Right.
Yeah. So
too bad you couldn't do that by video conference.
Right.
We could do a joint live streaming show installation.
That would be funny.
We did a joint installation for Western Cascade and Crescent Lodge a couple of years ago. It was quite an interesting conundrum. It was a lot of guys
in the same building at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yikes.
Well, no, and physically in the same, we literally installed both lodges at the same time.
Oh
So,
my.
Do you? Yes. Do you? Yes.
Sounds like a mass wedding.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. We have just a few minutes left on this show, but there's something that you do that's really cool as part of the Combat Vets that I really like, a ceremonial ride that you do for certain brothers in arms, I guess is really what I should, not brothers, but can you talk about that a little bit?
We actually do 3. So we have what we call an All Patriots ride once a year, and we invite in all 50 states and in Korea and Germany, believe it or not, we invite all military affiliated groups to come, and we do usually a between 50 to 250 mile ride, and that one's kind of cool. We also do another, we call it the Silent Ride for PTSD, and we'll go to a picturesque location as opposed to, a Harley dealership. I don't ride a Harley, by the way, just saying. But a couple years ago, there's a replica of Stonehenge down in Goldendale, Washington, down on the Columbia River. And it is a truly silent ride. I mean, everybody starts in their own location, ends up there, gets to the location, and then there is a memorial service for those we've lost. And then it's generally, we talk about the suicide awareness a lot, and gather people together, and then we go away in silence. Same idea. So that's 2. And then we have at least one poker run where each of our state meetings will do and our national meetings will do. We were able to, last year we did a very cool scenario where the national was going to be held in Boise. And so in Washington State, we held our state meeting in Spokane the weekend prior so that we could not come home and just go ride a bunch of fun motorcycle roads for a week and end up in Boise and then ride home. We ended up, a couple of us were over 2,000 miles by the time we were done.
Wow. Well, we do also, as Steve mentioned, want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about to plug your authorship as well, your book. Can you give us the names of the books, and are you doing any signings and events like that are coming up?
Okay, the world name is Meteri. The 2 book titles of the 2 novels that are out are Saving Ramos and Wings Tip the Scales. They both have the world name at the beginning of the title. It's all on Amazon for Kindle or for paperback. And normally I've been doing 2 book signings a year. I was supposed to do one this fall and I didn't. So I've been doing them in March and like October. I want to do one before Christmas, but I've been having some issues getting stuff done on time. I'm trying to get the 3rd novel out by the end of the year. So things that interrupt my writing, like, I don't know, podcasts, get in the way. I'm just kidding. This has been a lot of fun. I think I am going to try and do one more book signing before Christmas. So hopefully like the middle of December. Awesome.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time today to come out and visit with us and talk about military and the veterans and masonry, but military in general. And again, thank you to all that have served, and thank you to the U.S. and Canadian forces and all those that are around the world, and all the Masons that are veterans again and military.
Hey, Dave.
Yes, sir.
Let me say one more thing. What's interesting to me about the novels is because of the low-level combat stuff, a lot of my readers that are adamant about, hey, when's the next book coming out, are combat vets because of the way I write combat. But you Masons will be interested to, if you read the novels, every now and then you will find a little bit of a detail somewhere that you go, hey.
Little tidbit in there, huh?
Yep, exactly.
Excellent. Well,
thanks, JD, for coming out. It was really great to talk to you.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, really appreciate you spending the time with us.
No worries. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Thanks again, everyone. We appreciate your time here on the Working Tools Podcast.